So clearly you could see that I was either wisely foolish or foolishly wise, saying yes to him. 2018, November 19, I still remember that date. I think looking back, clearly I said that, if Nandan Pramod would ask that question, I said, Nandan, can I keep this job even if I have to pay you? Not that you need that money. But it's been that fascinating journey. And clearly, innocently audacious is something that comes very, very echoingly loud in some of the pursuits, because we had no clue what we were getting into when we taken this. I thought I understood something about mobility, and they said, okay, it's unbundling mobility. Those were the two words as a cue that I got on a Friday evening for a conversation on Monday. And I thought, okay, let's do some whiteboarding. And I didn't know. And the best pitches are the pitches where you don't know your walk making a pitch. And that sort of whiteboard conversation on 1 hour led to this conversation. That's my origin story with Beckn. Of course, there's a lot of backstory that now Pramod shared. So I'm not going to talk about why and therefore, which I think Pramod spoke about. I would probably talk about the what side of Beckn. And for me, the what has many dimensions to it. Ansha, you asked me to talk about the what and explain Beckn a bit more. And it's sort of little abstract, little convoluted, too many names, too many synonyms. Sometimes it says, has Beckn been renamed to FIDE or FIDE been renamed to ONDC? And is Beckn inspired by ONDC? All those questions. I know there's a lot of jargons floating around, but I'll simplify that as well. But I think more importantly, I want to talk about the many levels in which one could look at Beckn and why those levels sort of adds more perspective to how we want to imagine and be innocently audacious about this idea. For me, it's been 5 years, so I think it's kind of become deeply philosophical for me. So I don't want to bore you with that philosophy anyway. I'll stop probably at a good time through my talk. But I hope this conversation will lead to some reflections. But there's one thing that I want to say, and it's so emotional moment for me. Ravi would know this. May 24th, 25th, 2020, we were literally waiting on a Zoom call, squatting flies, waiting for the first community member to show up. And it never happened. And we said, okay, let's try and do something. I said, when we came up all kinds of FOMO stories, none of them worked. But from there to be here in this esteemed organization, to have this community sort of believe in this idea and contribute and let the story fly with an idea of Beckn we never thought of, that Beckn could be so much. Thank you, pandemic, for making that sort of acceleration happen. But with that, let me just get started. So Beckn, there are many ways, as I said, to look at Beckn. I think the simplest way that I would probably articulate, Pramod, please forgive if I say something which are technically not there or conceptually not in place. But for me, the way I read Beckn is, one, at a very, very simple level, I see it as a language of transactions. Yeah, any economic transactions consumer provider has an inherent vocabulary that we seem to be using often without knowing that there is a common vocabulary in any type of economic transactions. Yeah, and this language of transactions is no different from the other languages that we have seen in the world. We know the languages of HTTP, the language of the web, SMTP, the language of email communication, TCP/IP for computer networks, and of course UPI, the language for instant money transfer, stored value to stored value transfer. So it's like, okay, Beckn is filling that gap of having a language for economic transactions, thinking of a transaction internet or a transaction open network. That's one way to look at Beckn. So let me just unpack these few terms that are there. The transactions themselves. What kind of transactions are we talking about? Is it a type of transaction? People say that, oh, Beckn is a commerce protocol. Okay, but Beckn is a mobility protocol. I said Beckn is a star.star protocol. Pick and choose. So we went from mobility, retail, food, logistics. Of course, Gaurav and the Except team said, can we put this on education and skilling? Then we talked about jobs, agricultural advisory, health, financial services, energy, legal services, manufacturing, tourism, and the list goes on. So there's something fundamental about this language that seems to be working for multiple sort of sectors, multiple sort of domains, and across multiple regions. Yep. And that's one thing that welfare services, we're talking about decentralized schemes with Haq Darshak as one of the volunteers trying to see how do we look at scheme discovery. and scheme applications as a way for government schemes to make actually the excluded get included through schemes. And some of the aspects of the language itself, when I say it's a language, clearly it's a machine-readable language. Although it's funny, English has become machine-readable thanks to AI. So I'm going to not say machine-readable language as machine-readable language anymore, because English has become the machine-readable language. I want to call it programmable language. Extremely lightweight specification. So with number one, Beckn, hey, can you talk about your platform a little bit more? Okay, it took me 3 years to get 3 conversations on ONDC shift from platform to protocol. Yeah, and this is before the origin story, incorporation story of ONDC. So it is clearly a protocol, a bunch of specifications, literally a document. UPI was 1.5 pages. Beckn probably is 2.5. We're trying to get it shorter, and you'll see some of that today. And then it's also tech and cool thing to say, AI neutral. Literally, it's agnostic to any sort of machine or agent interface. It does not need blockchain. Another Web3 question that I get. It does not depend on web itself, on HTTP. It could be on TCP/IP or any other fabric. So it's completely tech agnostic. It's more of a semantic interoperability. Think of it as a dictionary which establishes the essence of how two entities interact. And I'll talk about that in a bit. It also presents itself with an architecture. So Beckn is a language which, when put together, it manifests a certain architecture which is fundamentally an open network, a decentralized open network. Yeah. Now, it could also create closed networks. It could create private networks. And I'll talk about how some startups globally are creating private networks with Beckn, but it essentially creates a network architecture. And because that's the fundamental essence of Beckn, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Now, talking about the nature of transactions. So what exactly are these retail transactions, mobility transactions? Deep down, it's fundamentally the basic atomic transaction between any consumer and any provider of an economic resource. We can choose what that economic resource is. You saw that last floating list that I showed. It could be a retail, a grocery item, energy, doctor's calendar for teleconsultation, idle plant for manufacturing, contract manufacturing, or it could even be a beekeeping calendar. So all of these are emerging possibilities. It's totally peer-to-peer. Now, what does it mean by peer-to-peer? 2-3 aspects of peer-to-peer. I don't want to get technical, especially in front of Pramod. But largely what we are saying is it fundamentally makes this decentralized, where the consumer and provider need not get onto one platform to discover each other and talk to each other. And that sort of obviates these needs of an operator, a central intermediary being there to do that onboarding of a consumer and provider. That's one. The second part of peer-to-peer is that both ways actually look the same. Each node can play a provider or a consumer on the fly, on the network. And this is what we are seeing with cascaded open ONDC network. You have a consumer node, which is called the buyer app, placing order on a seller app. But the seller app is essentially a buyer of logistics services or a wholesale services. The same app playing both the roles. So that's the other aspect. It is universal. We said, I think the last conversation we had, Pramod, last week was, can data be the catalog? So we are creating an open data economy, wherein data sets, in whatever form they may be, it could be, file storage, streaming data, multimodal data, can we make it available, particularly to accelerate climate action? So can we create data sharing networks? So data could be a resource. Retail could be a grocery item, could be a resource, or any other such resource, economic resource that enables a value exchange. Now, whenever I say transactions, it kind of creates a very jarring sort of a signal in the mind, especially in some of the sectors where not everything is transactional, like education, like social welfare. For me, I take a very purest sense of transaction, but any value exchange, it need not be commercial, but there exists fundamental social contracts to make that value exchange possible, even if they are informal. So any value exchange or any sort of a resource is what makes Beckn universal. And this is the most interesting part, combinatorial. It can bring multiple resources at multiple legs of a transaction together. I can have, and this is one of the favorite examples I take, especially somebody says, give me a 30-second or a 3-minute elevator pitch on Beckn. I said, imagine, we all are in Bangalore now, so imagine going from here to the airport, catching your flight, and you have a 2-hour journey ahead of you. An Uber can get you a taxi. A Zomato can get you coffee. But can there be an app which can get you a ride, preferably a Namayatri, and on the way have a coffee delivered to you, where the delivery address of that coffee is a moving Namayatri auto? That's interoperability. That's a combinatorial possibility that can happen with essentially keeping the same universal language of Beckn. Pramod touched upon this, and this is so critical. And as we talk about moving into the age of AI, this idea that a language, a protocol that is written in 2020 has had this wisdom of having seen how other protocols perform, especially the Web3 evolve. So one of the key things early into the design was to say that, does the two nodes which are interacting on a network like ONDC, do they need to have a prior model of establishing trust with each other, due diligence with each other, or can they simply execute contracts on the fly, where contract establishes the terms of the value exchange, gives them a recourse should the transaction not pan out the way it is supposed to be, especially in a decentralized network. So how do we establish trust on the fly, especially when the ecosystem is a low trust ecosystem? So that is where creating this little programmable contracting infrastructure that can work on the fly to unlock new opportunities for a small seller or a gig worker to quickly establish terms of business and do business, and not needing a big aggregator do that for him or her, is one of the important unlocks we see that Beckn is offering. And we see that playing out in multiple sectors, even in sustainability. Now, this is particularly very interesting. And this is where probably the best of times that Ravi and I had in FIDE, we had nothing else to do, no projects. And this is a wacko idea, as Pramod said. So we said, can we unbundle this? Okay, we separated the buyer and seller, unbundle. Can we unbundle further? We kept on unbundling. We went to a level where we couldn't come back, like level 6. And suddenly, you feel like a movie in Matrix. Oh God, that is Beckn, this is Beckn, this furniture can be on Beckn, that light can be on Beckn. It's because we significantly hear this 1,000-layer cake, the milfoil of an economic transaction, chop, 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 and says, what if nothing happens in a sequence? What if I can pick and choose any of these strands and think of a conversation? We were stress testing, saying that, how many of you have used Yulu bike or any of those bike sharing? Many of you, right? So you don't search for a bike, you find it in the physical world. Now imagine a Beckn transaction on that, wherein you just walk up to the bike, the bike is already there, you discovered it off the grid, you scan the QR code, and that QR code scan is directly an order, a contracting transaction. That unlock of lock is a contracting. So which means I don't have to always go through search, order, search, discover, find, add it to the cart, check out. Some of these are just click and go. Imagine an Amazon Go, walk into the store and walk out without having to go to the billing counter. You're doing billing on the fly. All these are going to happen on ONDC. Something really exciting is coming up with those kind of possibilities. And that idea means if we can fundamentally unstrand or separate and create these 1,000 pieces of how you want to mix and match, you will have a really, really exciting commerce, a way of commerce which has not even been imagined, unlock a whole new form of experiences that we haven't even thought of, solving for inclusion and innovation at scale, and reducing the cost, not having to go through all the 100 things where you don't have to go through. Now, let me switch to the next level of how I want to explain Beckn. And this is something that I am deeply, deeply passionate about. And this idea that, and this is where I get a little philosophical, some of my friends from Societal Platform may know, I talk about this idea that if the world depends on few lone heroes, we are already set up for failure. The best thing is to have everybody stand up, have the agency to fight for it. Okay? We are actually, Beckn is somewhat an antithesis to a superhero story. He said, can there be a way for every node to be autonomous, self-empowering, empowering the people on that node, and restore their agency? The only way it can happen is to take away that power extracting node in the center and making it decentralized. Now, this is a great design, and that for me, this is called the school of architecture with Pramod. How do you think of designs that think about intersection of power, agency, and technology? And this is one case where I've been asking myself that I haven't understood internet enough. After I've started figuring out the designs of Beckn with Pramod, I said maybe it's time to understand internet again. Because if there is any form of technology that extracts the power the least from its users and emits maximum power, is this protocol, our protocols. And that's what Beckn fundamentally does. Yeah. So one of the ways of looking at Beckn is how do you think of taking away that center from the equation and create that distributed agency? This is the next interesting part. How do we go from very consumer, product and service centric to purpose centric? I mean, Ravi was not married then and he should take fun that, Ravi, maybe if you want to go out on a date, imagine if you got a really bad car to pick you up and pick your date. What if the app that you're using figure out that it's actually a date and maybe gets you a mug, maybe with a bottle of champagne inside, contextually. Elevate ride-hailing to another form of purpose. Sorry, Ravi, I'm taking a lot of dig on you today. But that way of purpose centricity, think about solving for education and inclusion from a purpose-centric standpoint of view. Solving for learning outcomes through that way of shifting the narrative, because you're not solving for each element of the transaction in an isolated way. You're making them self-organize and come together to solve the larger purpose, which has many strands to it. And that's something that open networks can unlock and create. We haven't done it before, so it may look a little tedious, but as we progress through this, and as you can see with the traction of ONDC, those are some of the emerging use cases that will happen. This is something that I recently heard from a professor at MIT. He said, what you guys are actually doing is to take away the burden of curating, organizing extensively a set of experiences that I choose for him and say, okay, you got to live with this. Now, if there are any exceptions to that experiences, maybe you're on your way and the EV charger is not working, tough luck. Even if there's another EV charger, it's not on my platform, so you can't use it. But can you help yourself self-organize your intent, your needs by the network? Can the network become more self-organizing for your experience flows, consumption flows, all that? So this shift from organized commerce to self-organizing, that's the real power of network as we sort of bring these various elements into picture and solve for uncertainty and navigate uncertainty, which is my next point. How do you, generally the designs are saying avoid complexity. Give me a set number of catalogs, there's a set number of process flows, I'll follow that and this is what I offer. But what if with that little biryani you wanted to have a samosa and not make it two separate orders because they come from two different restaurants? I just feel like having it on an ice cream with it. Any sort of in complexity, uncertainty that you want to deal with, how do you make the network respond for you? Network figure out the solution for you rather than you figuring it out in your mind how to go about doing it. And that's one of the ways to look at Beckn. Now, I'm going to give you the third way of looking at Beckn. And this is somewhat more of a theory of change that I've been aspired to beyond Beckn, from learning from all the works Pramod and Nandan have done. And this is for me, and Sanjay Purohit very eloquently calls it the thinking of scale, the forest variety. We make in this form of design, there's the garden variety and the forest variety. Now, clearly, I don't have to ask which one offers more scale. The forest. But which one actually needs a gardener? The garden. Forest does not need a curated operator. It finds scale within itself. The scale feels the ambient ecosystem, the soil, everything, the flora and fauna, the many rich biological interactions that happen, millions of them, actually create that equilibrium and scale over and over again. It's a self-organizing, self-scaling systems. And that is the variety of scale. Countries like India with kind of diversity, the kind of challenges. India is the shopping mall for all the problems, including climate. So how do we solve at population scale? And how do we think of forest variety of change? And that is something that I'm very passionate about. And there are multiple ways in looking at the forest. One is to take a look at the ONDC network itself, where there's an extremely small network facilitator like ONDC Limited, a not-for-profit company, with an audacious goal of changing commerce from where it has been languishing for last 10, 15 years of 6% to 30, 40, 50%. Create this massive forestry around this idea of an open network. Now that's one form of forestry. Extremely small footprint for a facilitator, but massive exponential scaling. Now what's interesting is that when there are multiple networks coming up, and these are the networks that are coming in India, 6 of them on the top, 3 of them are outside of India, the one in the below, where 6 networks start scaling like forests, whether it's the energy network, the healthcare network, the commerce network of ONDC, the education and skilling network, or the new agriculture advisory network of Vistar, when all of them start scaling the same way. Similarly, when they start sort of interacting with other forestry of networks that are happening, like the network that is coming up in Belém in Brazil, it's actually inside the forest, Amazon, and Open Gambia, mobility network, soon to be commerce. We also have Kenya Agriculture Network with Kuza as one of the volunteers leading it. If all of them create, we are talking about a much wider forestry around the network of networks. And what is the soil? The common soil being the same protocol. So how do we unlock the forest variety of scale when you have common underlying abstracted principles of transactions, consumer-provider interactions? So that's something which I think is a powerful idea, and I'm still trying to grapple with that. Imagine if that takes off. That was the paradigm that internet showed us. And I think open networks can create that forest variety of scale as an ecosystem, as a paradigm to think about. Now, while this is happening, there's a whole sort of flora and fauna happening within these forests, actually expanding this forest. These are individual enterprises innovating at scale, either pivoted on Beckn, inspired by Beckn, or co-originating with Beckn. These are all new ideas that are redefining, as Pramod said, new way of doing old things or new way of doing new things. Whether it's Akhil from Pulse and Kazan trying to reimagine how energy, EV charging interoperability, a new way of solving for a new population scale behavior that we all want to have is to drive EV adoption as a way of thinking to solve. And for them to unbundle their own platform thinking. They should be building these moats. But they said, no, we will come together, unbundle ourselves, because what we need is first to create the forest before we extract the value. And we need to create that forestry very, very quickly. We need to build that field building before value extraction. That's some of the things that is happening. I want to touch upon the 2 on the top, Orchestro and Green Earth. Orchestro is a Silicon Valley-based private company, raised some good money to create a private network, a private ONDC, as a unified parcel delivery network, or as an open Amazon. Everything that open Amazon does beyond the marketplace, behind the marketplace, from parcel delivery all the way to logistics, fulfillment, etc. That's a private network. So somebody is trying to create this as open network as a business model to scale and allow other partners to come in and feed into that forestry and make the forest grow. That's one. Then you see Green Earth. Green Earth is a privately run global green hydrogen exchange. And when they're thinking about exchange, moving away from the conventional centralized exchange where there's an exchange operator, they're saying, can we create exchange as an open network with Beckn protocol? So that's another way entrepreneurs are thinking. And there are more such opportunities. Of course, I don't know how to talk about Namayatri, Kenya, we have a great story with Kuza. In fact, we say we should do networks at the Kuza. Amazing, in 3 months, we have a big network with 20,000 farmers live in Kenya. And that's something that's happening at a phenomenal scale. We are solving for welfare and schemes inclusion with Hak Darshak. Plots, being that little plumbing middleware to say anything on Beckn, I can get you connected to the network. I'm a network connector, and that's my business model. So these are all imaginations that are happening with Pulse. So that's probably was the fourth way of looking at Beckn. Yeah, did I overdo my expectations here with you? The next one is the future. Future that beckons, and Pramod touched upon it. And I think there are two central areas, two central big signals where Beckn seems to sort of naturally play a role. And Pramod talked about it. One is the climate change. Extremely complex, multi-dimensional. It's something that's happening at scale that needs to be responded at scale. No private company, one individual, one organization, or one government can alone solve this problem. Doesn't that work? Even if Maldives wants to be climate resilient, it will sink as a country. So this is a global problem. And that's very complex. And for the first time, we have a wicked problem which is also time-bound. We've got to get this done quickly. Otherwise, the Earth is continuing to warm up and it's going to create the cyclical flywheel of heating up the planet. So we have to respond at scale and at speed, which is probably the most wicked problem at population scale that we are confronted with. And while this is happening, we have the global south saying we are the growth engines for the world economy. We want to consume more energy because we want economic development. We want more consumer goods to be sold and supplied. Please don't bring climate as an out of syllabus in our way of growth. How do we then think of economies, which is again unprecedented, as a way to grow, let's say at 7%, 8% year on year, without carbonizing the planet where the other economies have grown in the past? Nobody has done that before. How do you create economic growth without carbonizing? That's a new model of growth that everybody is exploring. That is the uncertainty that we are dealing with, where we think open network as a way of thinking can solve for one dimension of these complex problems, which is around a coordinated action at scale. Whether it's individual actions, community actions, government actions, big enterprises, small enterprises actions, small businesses, can we all coordinate and do this on scale? Because that is the problem. That is the scale at which the problem needs a response to. Then, of course, we are fully and totally into the age of AI. Yeah, I spent last night literally debugging. I haven't done debugging for like good 15, 20 years, but I was trying to do debugging with whatever little hopeless skill set. There was more nuisance than a solution for the team. But I realized, how soon can AI take this job and debug this fully, quickly? And we have some really cool stuff to show, by the way. Yeah, that's some of the reviews I'll talk about. But we believe that Beckn's effort of accelerating coordinated action will be further accelerated by AI. Imagine if we can have AI-based solutions like Bashini, helping the shopkeeper to do transactions on ONDC in the local language, where the shopkeeper is receiving orders in Gujarati while the seller is speaking into the software or that agent in Tamil. Solve for language diversity and complexity. That's one form of inclusion. There are several other forms. Typing literacy. I don't need that. Completely voice-based. Right? And imagine building new apps on the fly, contextually relevant, disposable apps or bots just to do my part. These are all ways of solving for formalizing the economy and accelerating the effort that Beckn is already doing. There's a second dimension. Probably I haven't discussed with you, but this is a thought that came to me yesterday because I was having this conversation. In an ONDC kind of a network, even if one node is enabled by AI, it actually benefits the entire network. So you don't have to have every node have the AI capability. Because that node will solve for the context of that particular user and make it easy. Make that seller a bit more discoverable, even if that AI node is somewhere in the far end of the network. So how do we kind of distribute the value of AI to far ends is a possibility that I see, and I could see that with some of the demo that we're trying to put together. You will clearly see why I'm saying this. Then, There's a third dimension. I never thought that there will be a time when I say, oh, I think AI will need Beckn. I was like, first of all, I don't know where AI is going in first place in terms of hype. One of the things that people have been saying that you don't need interoperability in AI, which we kind of have a very strong view of, we don't agree with. And the reason being this, that I think of Beckn as the essential, responsible contracting infrastructure to ground truth any agent-to-agent interaction. You don't want to believe your agent saying the hotel is booked and show up in the hotel and saying, sorry, which hotel, which room are you talking about? Which agent did I speak to? So you need to have ground truthing, especially when it comes to transaction AI. We believe that Beckn as a contracting infrastructure can add more trust and responsibility to the economy, where we're going to see significant hybrid, agents to agents, agents to humans, humans to agents. In that kind of a world we are walking into, I think Beckn offers a tiny but vital feature of enforcing contracts, building trust at a population scale, even if there are AI agents interacting. Now, Prabhu spoke about it. I really believe this. Uncertainty is a feature, not a bug. I must be saying this 1,000 times a day, especially when we have some of the demos flopping big time. But this is an example of uncertainty. I know I deliberately busy. Okay? It is something that I have walked into recently on the energy landscape. The whole energy industry, just like the automobile industry, 200 years old, is going through this big momentous shift. There are three big drivers, or the third one that is accelerating the other two drivers. One is, of course, we want low-cost energy. It's always a need. How do you get low-cost energy? How do you make that energy reliable? Because pretty much everything needs energy, what we do. Yeah, you must be checking the battery on your phone probably 3 times or 5 times a day. And third is, how do we make it clean? In these three, there are different, uneven, unstructured transformations that we are seeing. Of course, generation is coming closer to the first mile. We have solar coming up. Okay, but what do I do with the excess energy? Can I push it back? Is the grid willing to take? In fact, we are on a conversation where Pramod is advising on creating a national solar rooftop registry, because the grid doesn't know where the solar rooftops are, where they're trying to pump energy into the grid from through which feeder. This will kind of upset the apple cart of a day-ahead planning that the grid is used to for several years. How do you manage that uncertainty, that complexity? You cannot say, don't buy solar and install solar anymore. You cannot say, don't buy EV cars. That's a whole new set of demand hitting the grid. Yeah? And the fun part is, everybody uses EV car. Everybody reaches home in the evening, peak hour, peak energy consumption, and we plug it in. Because we don't want to come in the middle of the night to switch it on, right? So this demand is coming not just heavy, but it's coming heavy at the bad time during the peak energy consumption. So how does grid deal with that? So these are several such complexity. The question we were asking, and I was in a conversation with the International Energy Agency, who kind of create global frameworks on energy for across countries. Pretty much everybody follows their best practices. And they said, how do we deal with this? Is there an answer? The answer is no. And this is where we think ideas like energy network, self-organizing, evolving, moving innovation to the edges as an idea seems to resonate to solve for one dimension of that complexity. And as Pramod says, that takes this whole effort of solving for climate action, solving for green energy to the next level of equilibrium, because what's happening is each of these individual efforts are solving for cost of access, cost of scale, cost of transaction, all of that individually. But what if we were to move on to this new playground, new fabric like an open net, where if we sort of universally lower the cost, just like how UPI did for moving money. If we can create a shared infrastructure, just like the digital roads, and reduce the cost, create rapid cost curve decline in these efforts, which benefits all on the top, maybe we have a good fighting chance to do it well and do it in time. So that's one of those things about uncertainty that I see is a feature, not a bug, at least in the times we are living in. And this is what Pramod keeps saying. Don't ask what is the solution. You know what is the solution? You're saying you can see the future, especially in today's world. We thought ChatGPT was awesome, and then Devin showed up, and then something else is showing up pretty much every week. Yeah, so question is, make that chase irrelevant and solve for optionality and let the network figure it out. Because we don't know which one will be the right solution or the solution, but instead, let the network create this playground where the solutions emerge to solve at scale. No point having solutions which look great, like a garden variety, but how do we solve for forest variety? And that's where I thought I explained 4 different ways of how I look at Beckn. And I hope this is sort of resonating with maybe some of the questions you were already facing, saying that, okay, these are very complex abstract problems, but is there a way, a method, obviously coming from the larger DPI thinking, but specifically about protocol and open networks, as to how do we solve?